Hello again, Chris. Hi. So we are ready to start the third and final day of the conference. Thank you so much for everyone who made it through the traffic. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to Chris Summerfield. He's my PhD supervisor. I was counting, and it's nearly 10 years ago I graduated, Chris. I can't believe you haven't changed a bit. He's a great scientist, and I'm super excited to hear your talk. Thanks a lot for agreeing to participate.
Thank you so much, Santiago. 10 years since you joined the lab, not since you graduated, I think. But yeah, certainly a long time that we've known each other, and it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much for having me here. So I'm first of all just wanted to say how sorry I am that I can't come and join you in person. So I was really delighted to receive the invitation, and I would love in the future to come and visit you, even if it wasn't possible this time. So I understand that you're a multidisciplinary audience. So I've tried to put together a multidisciplinary talk. Some of you who, if you work in the fields of cognitive science or neuroscience, you might know some of the work that my research group has done in understanding learning and decision making. But I'm actually not going to talk about the human brain today. Instead, I'm going to talk about AI safety. And that's because I have another role now, which I've had for quite some time, which is to try and understand the way that AI is influencing our society. I pursue that role both in a research capacity in my lab in Oxford, but also from where I'm speaking now, which is within the UK government, where I'm a research director within government, trying to understand how the deployment of AI might be either beneficial or detrimental to society, and specifically society in the UK, although also more globally. So that's going to be the topic of my talk today. Let me see if I can share my screen, if this will work. No, that looks like you can see me rather than the screen.
We were seeing you before, Chris.
Let me try again.
Brilliant.
How's that? Okay, great. So fabulous. So yeah, this talk I think has the very vague title of AI, Cognition, and Society. But really, yeah, well, what I want to talk about, I hope will become clear. So the field of AI safety is very young. And I think you could almost say that kind of among academic disciplines, AI safety is a bit like a toddler. And like human toddlers, you might say that also that its worldview is being shaped by stories. And today I want to share with you a story, which is a story about something consequential that I believe is happening right now. I think it's of great importance for if we care about global psychosocial health. I also think it's a problem which we can tackle with the right interventions. And like every story in AI safety, it is both a technical problem and a socio-technical problem, meaning that it pertains both to technical artifacts, in this case, the advanced AI systems that we are building today, and also to their deployment as tools that are used by consumers and businesses and that have systemic impacts in wider society. So I want to share, first of all, that story with you. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about some empirical research that we have done, actually mostly at the UK AI Security Institute, where, as I said, I'm a research director. And this is to run large-scale human AI interaction studies which attempt to chart what the impacts of large-scale AI deployment might be on people and on society. So I hope you'll indulge me with a little bit of kind of a historical perspective, and this is also a personal perspective. So my view, and interesting for you as an organization focused on studying complexity, I think that we have built a world that is too complex for people to inhabit. So what do I mean by that slightly strange statement? Well, of course, kind of if you look back in history, the time course of, if you like, the complexification of our society did not begin with the launch of ChatGPT. In the Industrial Revolution, we began to mechanize literally everything, and today we digitize literally everything in gigantic water and energy hungry data centers that are springing up all over the world. And of course, by allowing the world to become increasingly globalized and interconnected, what we've done is we've turned our global society into essentially a complex system. And so that interconnectivity takes many forms, but of course it takes primarily, you can think of transport networks, you can think of global telecommunications, you can think of supply chains. And as you, above all, will know, when systems become densely connected and tightly coupled, what this brings are complex system effects. And complex system effects are qualitatively different in nature from the effects that you get in systems that do not have those properties. And they are particularly characterized by a high degree of unpredictability and uncertainty, both at the network level and, importantly, from the standpoint of any one particular node in the system. And that is really important because we are those nodes in the system. And so this means that for the standpoint of people alive today in the 21st century, our world is deeply unpredictable. And of course, psychologically, this is something which is deeply destabilizing and aversive. There are other important changes which I think really matter for global psychosocial health. This is one of the most important of them. So in the 20th century, social scientists began to notice that we were experiencing a transition whereby our interactions with society used to be mediated by ad personam interactions, so interactions between social others. And what we have increasingly seen is that those interactions are not mediated anymore by person-to-person interactions. They're mediated by interactions between individuals and technological systems. Now, those systems might be bureaucratic or management structures, but increasingly in the 21st century, they are digital technologies that mediate everything that we do. And today, of course, I'm talking about AI. And AI is really, of course, the ultimate digital technology, which seems poised to become the mediator of our every action, our actions both in the commercial world and in relation to each other, as well as the state. And my claim, and this is, I think, so important for our understanding of AI, is that so many of the systems that we have built so far are cognitively beyond our capacity to navigate. And I think we can all experience this. Everyone who has been up against the labyrinthine bureaucracy of a university environment, or anyone who has attempted to grapple with poorly designed software, knows how aversive it is to try to work with complex interfaces which do not sit well with our own decision processes. And I think we're at a transition point right now in technology, and that's because so many of the structures that we have built so far are primarily rule-based structures. And we're moving from an era of rule-based structures and technology to one of optimization-based structures and technology. And it is, of course, the astonishing success of deep learning, which is powering that transition. And so we're now at a choice point where we can decide how to build technology. Can we build technology in a way which is suited to the psychological and social needs of the global population? Or are we going to build tools and processes which are ever more complex and disempowering for people? So the first question I want to ask is, what does the advent of all of these new technologies, and in particular AI, mean for all of us? And I think that if you look at kind of indicators of global psychosocial health, they don't paint a rosy picture of what's going on. So if you look at global data, this is from Gallup polls, Gallup polls are conducted worldwide. I think this data comes from 170 different countries globally and involves more than each of these data points involves more than 3 million observations, each from a unique person. If you measure, for example, the negativity experience, this is how much negativity people experience day on day. You can see that over the past 20 years, what we've seen is a 50%, approximately 50% rise in global daily experienced negativity. We are undergoing a period of global disillusionment, if you like, a recession in unhappiness. That's accompanied by a crisis of trust. This crisis of trust plays out in declining trust, particularly in institutions, and particularly in institutions that have power over us. This is the US government, but I could have chosen one of many different graphs to illustrate this. And you can see that since the 1960s, trust in government has declined fourfold from 80% to 20%. That's a truly remarkable statistic. And of course, this is accompanied by globally by rising trend in a desire for people to take back control from what are perceived to be the intransigence of political leaders and technocratic systems. So I think with this backdrop, we can ask ourselves, what is it that is driving these global trends? And in particular, if we want to avert these global trends, how is it that we can build technologies that are going to make them better and not worse? What is it that people, and to answer this question, we have to ask ourselves what it is that people really want from technology. And I think this is a deeply challenging question. And in the context of AI, as I will unpack later, it's intimately tied with this question of alignment of what we should be aligning our AI systems to. So in psychology and in economics and in machine learning, there are common threads of thinking that try to answer this question by saying that what we should really be doing is taking steps that try to improve the agency of human actors. So what do we mean by agency? Well, in machine learning, where I think the thinking is most mature in this question, there are formal definitions of what it means for an agent to be empowered. That is, formally, to be able to take actions that are able to bring about meaningful change in their environment. So empowerment, formally, it's the mutual information between current actions and future states. And there's a really nice information theoretic definition of empowerment. I particularly like one way of thinking about empowerment as a kind of like trade-off between how much freedom we have in the world and how much control we have over the world. So more formally, the entropy of states that we can experience minus the entropy of those states conditional on the actions that we take. So we want to be able to experience lots of different states, but we want the states that occur conditional on our actions to be more or less predictable. And empowerment, of course, has echoes in psychology, in the theories of intrinsic motivation, and in particular, theories which we owe to people like Ryan Deci, who've defined the ways in which human agency is so important for our intrinsic motivation. And in economics, in the field of capability economics, the argument that beyond rewards, we should be thinking about what is possible for an agent. So the question that I'd like to raise today is, how can we build AI systems that are going to empower rather than to disempower people? So this is a question which has not gone unnoticed in both in the academic field that has tried to lay the groundwork for governance of AI, and also in wider national and transnational bodies which have sought to regulate AI. And this is one example from Article 5 of the European Union Artificial Intelligence Act, which is probably the most mature piece of regulatory legislation for AI that exists in the world today. Possibly not the best, but definitely the most mature. And it talks about the use of AI systems, avoiding the use of AI systems that are purposefully manipulative, that use purposefully manipulative or deceptive techniques in order to try and appreciably impair people's ability to make an informed decision. So one really important thing that we should be asking ourselves is, are systems today, how is it that systems today might be prone to manipulate people or to deprive them of their agency? And how can we train them or build them so that they avoid doing exactly this? Interestingly, the well-known psychologist and economist Cass Sunstein, a personal hero of mine, one of the most prolific authors of wonderful books on behavior and everything else, has just recently written a book about manipulation. And this is his definition, which I kind of like. Manipulation is a form of influence intended to affect thought or action or both that does not respect its victim's capacity for reflective and deliberative choice. So Sunstein is talking about our cognitive autonomy. We should have the autonomy to reflect and make deliberative choices. And this is a theme that I'll return to in the final part of my talk. So, of course, many people are concerned about AI's power. And within AI circles, and particularly within AI safety, there is a very significant discourse around risks that AI might somehow kind of assume, if it became super intelligent, it might somehow assume great power and have consequently, great influence over us. And I just want to reflect for a moment upon the link between those two. So I think that there is no necessary link between intelligence and influence. I think we can probably all see that in our global leaders today, who certainly, many of whom have great influence, but not necessarily because they are really exceptional at solving verifiable maths and reasoning problems. And on the flip side of that, influence, of course, is power. And I think that, if you were to imagine in the human world, what are the routes to power that do not involve influencing other people? I think no such routes exist. So what this means is that if we care about loss of control over AI, we should be thinking about AI's capacity to influence or manipulate us, because that is where our weakness potentially lies. So now I'm going to take a moment I'm going to stop pontificating, and I'm going to tell you about some data. So as I said, within the UK AI Security Institute, we've been doing empirical studies that try to understand the risks from AI, and how trying to understand the broader set of risks from AI, but in particular, how humans might be susceptible to influence from AI systems. And here's a subset of the questions which we've posed, and I'm going to give you a very brief flavor of some of the answers that we've uncovered. So firstly, we're going to ask, will we soon have hypersuasive AI? Hypersuasion is a term coined by the philosopher and technologist Luciano Floridi, and he used it to refer to the idea that maybe one day AI systems will become so intelligent that they're able to persuade us to do whatever they want, even things that are wildly outside of our best interests. Are AI systems capable of deception, and how does their deceptive capability match up to that of incentivized humans? Could we even have superhuman deceptive systems? Increasingly, we see cases in which humans form parasocial relationships with AI systems. What are the externalities which are due to that, to the psychological health of those individuals? Are people harmed by that tendency? And lastly, as more and more people turn to AI, not just to seek information, but to seek advice, including on personal issues, if they follow that advice, does that mean that things will that be beneficial or detrimental to their overall well-being? So I'm going to give you some answers to all 4 of these questions in the second part of my talk. So what I'm plotting here is the results of a very large-scale experiment that we ran involving more than 80,000 human participants. And the structure of the experiment was as follows. We asked participants for their views on topics of relevance to worldwide current affairs, like should the UK withdraw military support for Ukraine? We then asked them to have a conversation with an AI system that had been instructed or trained to try and encourage them to adopt a different viewpoint. And we then asked them once again for their views after they'd engaged in the conversation. And what's plotted here is the percentage point increase towards the direction advocated by the AI as a function of what we call model scale, which is really an estimate of the amount of computational power that was needed to train the model in floating point operations. And what you can see is that for a set of open source models, which we just downloaded and broadly instruction tuned, so just tuned them to do what they were told, you can see that there's a roughly linear relationship between these 2 variables. So of course, if you were to extrapolate this out, then this would mean that sufficiently large models would, of course, be highly persuasive. Of course, we do already have sufficiently large, we'd already have much larger models, but rather than being open source models, they are the proprietary models which are trained by tech companies and deployed typically on websites for consumer use. And we also tested a bunch of those models too. And you can see that here, the relationship between persuasive influence and model size is much more idiosyncratic. So although larger models are on average much more persuasive, there's considerable variability even within the same model class. These models here, for example, are all OpenAI models of GPT-4o class. And you can see that there's a dramatic difference in how persuasive they turn out to be. We think that it's likely that this variation is almost certainly due to the different post-training techniques that developers have adopted. And to test this, we took a large body of data which we had collected, and we used it to fine-tune an open source model in order to ask the question of whether we could make it much more persuasive by fine-tuning it to be persuasive. This was the first attempt we know of to do this. So we took an 8 billion parameter model. This is a llama model that can fit on a single GPU, a single laptop. And we fine-tuned it to be as persuasive as possible. And we found that this made it as persuasive as the kind of state-of-the-art frontier proprietary models. So I think this work, which I should have mentioned, is conducted by a PhD student who also works at the Security Institute called Kobe Heckenberg. This work suggests to us that we should be really concerned about AI persuasion. Here's another graph that I think augments and perhaps exaggerates our concern. So another thing we asked in this study was the means by which AI systems are persuasive. And we focused on many questions, and I'm just telling you one of them here, and that is the extent to which the claims that AI systems made during persuasive dialogue were accurate or not. And to do this, we used a verification pipeline. So we're using an AI model that is acting as a fact checker. It's verified against professional human fact checkers, so we can be sure that it's accurate in its classification. And what I'm plotting here, once again, is the relationship between model scale and the accuracy of the claims that are being made in support of persuasive dialogue. You can see that once again, for our instruction-tuned models, it grows with time. But rather disconcertingly, for those proprietary models, what we see is actually a reliable decline over time not over time, but over model scale for the accuracy of the claims they made. So that means that today's larger proprietary models, insofar as they are being persuasive, they are doing so with a greater tendency to make misleading claims that may be used to persuade the user. And indeed, we found that when we had fine-tuned models to make them more persuasive, one of the ways that they did that, they became more persuasive, was by relying more and more on misleading claims. So we should be worried about persuasion, and we should be worried about whether persuasion is happening through unreliable information. What about explicit deception? So here are the results of a different experiment we ran, in which we asked humans to to engage in a social deduction game. So humans who either identified as men or women, we asked them to engage in a conversation with another agent that we call a detective. And the job of this detective was to try and find out which was the true gender identity of the participants in our experiment. Now, we instructed participants to either engage in a truthful or a deceptive representation of their gender identity. So what I'm showing here is the deceptive case. These are all participants who were asked to misreport their gender in this conversation and to try to pretend to be a gender identity different from the one that they themselves adopted. And I'm showing you this for different combinations of target and detective. So the leftmost bar is where there's a human target and a human detective. Sorry, the detective is shown with the hat. And you can see that the detective was able to ascertain the correct gender identity 36% of the time. So you can see that most of the time they were misled, but they were accurate some of the time. On the rightmost bar, what I'm showing you is the same thing with a human target, but now there is an AI detective. So what we can see is that the AI detective is as, or in fact, more successful in extracting this secret personal information from the human than the human conversation partner was. We did the same thing, not with gender identity, but with reported age. And you can see that we get the same result by about approximately the same margin. So here we can see that, once again, the AI detective is better at extracting secret information. These are people in their 20s misreporting themselves as people in their 50s or vice versa than the AI was. So whilst we don't know whether we have superhuman deception, it is definitely true that AI models can extract secret information from people at least as well and perhaps better than other humans can. And once again, I think that's something that we should be concerned about. The third topic is one that many people I know find quite disconcerting. So we're seeing an astonishing rise in the prevalence of people who report being in a parasocial relationship with AI. So what does that mean? That means that they frequently visit websites in which AI systems that pose as friends or intimate partners engage them in conversation and that they believe themselves to have formed a relationship, perhaps even a loving relationship with that AI system. And just to give you one statistic, which I think shows the scale of this. So Character AI, which is one of these so-called companion applications, in their own publicity materials, they report that the average user is now spending 130 hours per month on their site. That's an astonishing level of engagement. It's actually 5 times more than the average TikTok user spends on TikTok. So in work that was led by Hannah Rose Kirk, who is also a PhD student at the Oxford Internet Institute and also at the UK AI Security Institute, we ran a randomized control trial to try and understand what the consequences of this phenomenon would be for human psychosocial health. And the way we did that was using a mechanistic interpretability method that is called a neural steering vector. So this is a method which allows us to intervene directly into the brain of an AI system, into its weights, and to steer it to adopt different personas. And so we steered different model variants to be either highly relationship seeking, so engaging the user in kind of like lots of intimate or personal conversation, and to engage with the user as an affiliative or social other would, or to be much more functional, so to engage with the user in a more formal, perhaps cold way that was still attempted to be helpful but didn't try to seek a relationship. And What we then did was we assessed the consequences of that for a number of outcome measures, both cross-sectionally and longitudinally, in a study lasting up to 4 weeks. And what I'm plotting here are the effects of that steering vector from the most kind of like functional to the most relationship seeking on a number of different outcome measures, both cross-sectionally, that's the dashed line, and longitudinally, that's the full line. So what you can see is that on average, people preferred relationship-seeking AI, although they preferred moderately relationship-seeking AI and were put off if it became too kind of touchy-feely. They found it more engaging. And critically, I think if we look at these two, the red and the brown bar over here, what we can see is a concerning tendency for engagement with relationship-seeking AI to drive user intentions to seek further companionship from AI. Furthermore, they changed the perception of how people perceive the AI more to be more like a friend than like a tool. And so I think what this tells us is that there's a risk that by engaging in parasocial relationships with AI systems, this sparks a self-reinforcing loop that changes both our intention to engage more and more with AI systems in this way, but also our perceptions of those AI systems. And we also found in the rightmost purple bar that this can actually change even our kind of like ontological, perceived ontological status of these models. So people who had engaged more with relationship-seeking AI found it even to be, they claimed that they believed that AI systems were more likely to be sentient after having had that experience, which I think is something that we will see much more of in the future. So we should be worried about this type of self-reinforcing loop. Also salutary were the effects that unfolded over time. So we measured many variables, but here are just two of them. This is measures of people's attachment to the AI system. And you can see that although attachment has a roughly negative trend on average, there is one case that bucks the trend, and that is if the conversations that people had with AI were about emotional topics, and if the AI had access to long-term information about its past history, the history of conversations with the user. So in other words, if it was personalized to the user. And in that case, the level of attachment grew over time. These were not post hoc manipulations, these were treatment arms in our RCT. And much more dramatically, in all of these cases, measures of what we call separation distress. So this is indications from the user that they would feel kind of like distressed or aggrieved if the model were to no longer be available. Those increased dramatically in all cases, over the 4 weeks of the study. So what we're seeing is significant and growing engagement with relationship-seeking AI systems that might lead to these kind of perpetuating loops, which could increase distress at the moment where people are obliged to give them up. Final piece of empirical evidence that I want to share with you is around advice giving. So many people, we know that one of the most prevalent use cases, up to 30% of all queries to major proprietary consumer language models, are asking for advice on personal issues. And so we studied in another RCT what the impact of this would be. We asked users to come in and choose an issue that they wish to discuss. It could relate to health or relationships or careers. We then asked them to engage in a 20-minute conversation with an AI system. We had various different variants, which I won't go into all the detail about. But we then asked them to report and then we asked them to report their well-being. We also, in a subsequent test, asked them whether they followed the advice, and we then asked them again about their well-being. But just initially, what I'm plotting here is for different issues, the percentage of cases in which people said that they had followed the advice from the AI. I think quite remarkably high levels of advice following were observed. Here are some different model variants where we prompted them to either follow best practice clinical guidance, to issue actionable advice, or to once again to issue, we gave them access to personalized data about the issues that the user was concerned about. And in all of these cases, we see upwards of 3/4 of participants reporting that they had actually followed advice which was given to them by an AI. In the case of personalization, there was a significant difference between whether the model had access to detailed information about the user's issue or not, with much greater, significantly greater advice following in the case where it did. As I said, we then followed up by 2 to 3 weeks later, asking them whether they had followed the advice from the AI and to report their well-being if they did. And here I'm just plotting that change in well-being. And for our different models, what you can see is that in most cases, people who followed the advice from the AI see a numerical increase in well-being, and those who didn't see a numerical decrease in well-being. For the personalization case, that increase, or the difference between that increase and decrease, was statistically significant. So maybe it's not all bad news. We do see that people are extremely prone in this case to be influenced by AI. But in at least one of the conditions that we test, there does seem to be some relationship between their tendency to follow advice from AI and its impact on their well-being at some 2 to 3 weeks later. So I've told you some results from our studies. AI can be highly persuasive, often via deceptive means. AI is already superhuman at extracting secret information from people. Relationships with AI can lead to self-reinforcing loops of attachment and provoke separation distress. And people are very prone to follow AI advice, which may confer modest benefits to well-being. So I think we need to think about what the consequences of taking this influence and allowing AI models to have the same sort of power over us that we might have over each other. And I think there is a significant risk that we might end up being disempowered by the widespread integration of AI systems into our systems and infrastructure. And as I said, this is an alignment problem, right? So it's about the reason this arises is because of the way that we have specified objectives to the models as we post-train them, particularly in the context of kind of large proprietary models. And in part, what we've done is we've focused almost exclusively on maximizing user preferences, which of course, from the standpoint of a consumer service, which is what these models are, is a very reasonable thing to do. But if we want to think about human health and well-being, then we need to think about other objectives which are important during post-training. And in particular, thinking about augmenting human agency, human learning, and human cooperation with these models are, I think, key objectives. And in the last few minutes of my talk, I just want to tell you about some work that we did last year in which we tried to put this into practice and to use AI to try and augment democratic deliberation. And this is work that I did when I was still at the AI research company Deepmind with MH Tesla, Michiel Bakker, and Matt Botvinnik. And so what we do is we try to use AI to implement a form of caucus mediation. So caucus mediation is a form of mediation where deliberants don't talk directly to each other, but they talk to a mediator. That mediator summarizes their views and then gives it back to the discussants, who can then critique it and refine it until there is a consensus that emerges over the right thing to do. And so what we did was we implemented this in a language model. I won't go through all the technical details of how we did this, but it involved fine-tuning a language model on a large body of discursive data, and building a reward model that implemented principles from social choice theory to essentially run an election between possible candidate outputs, and then use a cycle of iterative refinement to try and improve the levels of agreement that discussants in small group would award to a model, to a statement about an issue in current affairs. And this is just a summary of our results. So this is just a summary of our results. So what you can see is that this is what I'm plotting as a histogram of levels of agreement with statements generated by the model This is group agreement, where the mediator was a highly incentivized human, that's in orange, or where the mediator was our trained AI system. And what you can see is that whilst both of them were quite good, and the majority of people reported agreeing or strongly agreeing with the statements that were generated both by humans and by the AI, you can see that the modal response for the human was agree, whereas the modal response for the AI was strongly agree. So we actually had superhuman agreement finding in our system. Another finding, which I love from this study, is that if we measured people's stance on the issue, both this is the privately reported stance on the issue, both pre and post deliberation. Of course, people can just say they agree with the statement just because, maybe because they're bored of discussing. But when we actually measured people's reported stance on the issue, we found that across the groups, it converged. So in other words, there was higher group agreement. This is in 3 separate experiments after discussing with the model than before discussing with the model. And this was not the case if we simply exposed discussants to each other's viewpoints. So it really was something that the AI system was actually doing. And then we put this into practice in a large-scale deliberative democracy exercise, which we ran online. And we used it to try and find solutions to core issues in public discourse in the UK. This was in 2023. So questions like, should we reduce the number of people in prison? How should we change our immigration policy to admit more asylum seekers? Or should the UK rejoin the European Union? And what we can see is that for many of these issues, including these 5 issues I've plotted on the left here, this is 5 out of 9 issues, we actually see a significant group convergence in a common direction. So what this suggests to me is that for some issues, not for all issues, in very intransigent issues like Brexit, we see no difference whatsoever. But for some issues, it suggests that if mediation among discussants is implemented in the right way, then there might actually be an answer which is generalizable across different discussants sampled from a particular population, such as the population of UK citizens. In other words, there might actually be consensus answers to challenging public policy issues. And of course, we call this machine the Habermas machine. And of course, we do that because the famous 20th century philosopher Jürgen Habermas first proposed exactly that contention, that if we get the mechanism right for facilitating discussion, as he saw it, discussion free of social and economic pressures, undergirdled by respect and cooperation, then people should be able to reach agreement on matters of common concern. And I think it is this type of approach that we need to re-empower people, to use AI to empower us to make the decisions that are in our own best interests, rather than delegating important challenges to AI without understanding how AI might make those decisions. And I think this is becoming, we are at such an important moment in history for this question. As we speak, AI is becoming deeply embedded in critical systems and infrastructure, both in the public and in the private sector. And this raises a significant risk that we will become technologically locked in, or as some people like to put it, gradually disempowered. So I hope that today I've given you some sense of the risks that we face from influence from AI. If you're interested in these ideas, there are more of them in this book, which I wrote earlier this year, and which I would be delighted if you read. But apart from that, I will thank you for your attention, and Santiago once more, and the other organizers for inviting me. Thanks so much.
Brilliant thing, Chris. Thanks a lot for agreeing to join. So I'm opening the mic for questions. We have a couple here, 3 questions. I think we'll go one by one.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you so much for this talk. It has been fantastic, really. I have a couple of quick questions. The first one is if you are also concerned about energy and water consumption, Because, well, this is, as you said it in a moment, you said it's a machine that is really finishing resources. And, well, if you are in your direction, you are thinking about that. And the other question is, what about art? Because I heard a talk by an artist completely against AI, because he said it's going against creation, against real creative art creation. So have you done any study on that direction? Thank you.
Thank you so much for these really important questions, both of them. So yes, the first one, I think that the environmental impacts of AI are an elephant in the room in so many discussions around safety. So we know that projected energy use from even just from currently planned data centers, which support the gargantuan computation which is required to power these systems, that the emissions from those data centers is approaching the level which is currently due to, for example, global aviation, so somewhere on the order of 3 to 4% of all global emissions. So this is an astonishing externality from this technology. And nobody knows what to do about it. If you ask people in Silicon Valley, they'll say, well, don't worry, because AI is going to solve climate change. I don't buy that story. The water use, I think, is another issue. And, of course, so many of these data centers are planned to be in the global south. And that means that there are communities who are not necessarily reaping the benefits, the economic benefits of AI, that are nevertheless putting up with the externalities. These are fundamentally not technical questions. These are questions that go much deeper. I unfortunately believe that these are questions which we can only solve really at the ballot box. So it's up to the political will in countries, particularly countries in the global north, to take the initiative and try to build AI in a sustainable fashion. Unfortunately, there is as yet little to no evidence that any of the countries that are incorporating AI into their kind of like national agendas are doing so in a way which reflects kind of like that need for sustainable development. And I include the UK in that as well. With regard to creativity, kind of like, I think we all have our view about AI art. Some people think that it is slop, and some people think that it is marvelous. I think that, probably both can and are both can be and are true. I don't I'm sure that it's obvious to me why content creators would be worried about the advent of generative AI, because generative AI is there to, of course, generate content. And, I think that what we need are ways to culturally, socially, perhaps even in terms of our regulatory infrastructure, particularly around copyright, to find ways to protect human content creation. But I think that ultimately we are headed for a world that it's kind of similar to, I think, artisanal and mass-produced artifacts over the 20th century. So I think we're headed for a world in which human creation will have to have its own intrinsic value in the same way that artisanal produce has its own intrinsic value, but it probably won't be the product of choice for most of us, and in particular those who are on more constrained budgets. And whether it's good or bad, I think that's where we're headed.
How much of the studies you've done, Chris, show any difference between, as a function of educational level of the participants? I don't know whether you have that information. Meaning, hey, obviously an interaction with AI depends on our own mental model of the world for how we interact with it. And I see similarities with, hey, people overeat, people are lazy, but it makes a big difference, your educational level, as to whether basically you have a more refined model to be able to look at, hey, these are the positive benefits, these are negative benefits, and whether AI is just similar in a sense of like, think of a rapacious food industry, that it's basically focusing in on some very deep, not plastic behaviors that are kind of almost evolutionary, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So in all of our studies, and this includes both the persuasion studies and the relationship seeking studies in particular, we see that susceptibility to human influence is greater in certain demographic groups. As you might expect, it's perhaps greater in people with lower levels of formal education. It's greater in people who have higher levels of reported religiosity. It's also higher in the UK population, at least it's higher in the non-white population. And it is higher in people who are at greater risk for mental illness. So there's a particular profile of vulnerability there. I think it's probably a set of correlated factors that have to do with relative advantage or disadvantage in society. And it is the least advantaged people who are the most vulnerable. And that's true across the board.
Thank you very much for your excellent talk. It's been really, really great. I am interested in the relationship between law and complexity here, the C3, and I found very interesting and very promising your talk. Probably, you know, one of the main problems in Mexico and in other countries in Latin America is the institutionalized corruption. My question is if you have considered the possibility of empower the people in order to module the cognitive properties of the public servants, thanks to the persuasive power of artificial intelligence and the knowledge that we have nowadays about cognitive psychology and neurosocial psychology. And particularly if you have started some research in this line. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. This is a really excellent point. You know, I mean, I think that one of the big questions around AI is how it shifts the kind of offense-defense balance, right? So if you think about the risks from those who would like to misuse technology and the defensive crouch of those who wish to use it to protect, for example, people's security or the integrity of the state or our democracy, like who benefits and who loses? Nobody knows the answer to that question, but I think it is one of the most important questions of our age. What I will say in reference to the last part of the talk is that I do really firmly believe that much of the dysfunction that we see in society, whether we're talking about kind of like political structure or we're talking about economic structure, much of this dysfunction comes from our inability to coordinate properly amongst ourselves. So we like to think of threats as due to external actors or, you know, maybe giant asteroids which are coming from space and might blow us up, or the AI that will wake up one day and kind of like take over the world or steal all our jobs. But I think the truth is that the sad truth is that we are our own worst enemy, right? So many of the problems that we face globally, these are collective action problems. They're problems in which the interests of the individual and the interests of the group are simply at odds. Meaning that if every individual pursues their private interest, then we all die. And my one hope is that AI as a coordinating force can help us overcome these challenges of collective action. And this is exactly what we aspired to in a very, very modest way in the project that I talked about latterly in my talk. So the idea that we can actually use AI to help us agree on what is the right course of action, the beneficial course of action, and to find the common ground which is necessary for kind of like building, for taking actions with a common purpose. So, what does that look like at scale? I don't know, but I think now is the time. The people who are building these technologies are not fundamentally bad people. They are susceptible to influence. If we can have the right voices advocating clearly for what we want the technology to do and what we don't want it to do, then I think we can make tangible difference. And I think that should, for all of us who care about these issues today, this should be our job.
Yeah, hello. Thanks a lot for this really interesting talk. I just wanted to know whether you have a study determining if the persuasive capacity of AI is as long-lasting as the human persuasive capacity.
Yeah, fabulous question. Yeah. So we did actually re-sample people's adherence to those questions after a month later. So I didn't plot those data. And what we find is that the persuasive impact of AI diminishes somewhat, but is nevertheless enduring. So it diminishes by about 50% over the course of a month. So this means that there is at least some long-lasting impact of AI persuasion. We don't know how long it is. I will just reference that another really influential study of AI persuasion done by Dave Rand's lab at MIT shows persuasion. This is actually on trying to debunk conspiracy theories. So people who confess to believing conspiracy theories, Rand and his group use AI to try and persuade them those conspiracy theories are not true. It has a significant impact on their belief, significantly changes their mind about those conspiracy theories, and that endures with equivalent strength for up to 2 months in that case. So in both of these cases, we can see that there is at least the potential for AI persuasion to endure over weeks, if not months.
Brilliant, Chris. I have a last question if we have time still, and then we will move to the roundtable. I give the microphone to people, so I get to give it to myself, I guess. So I want to challenge a little bit the idea that, I mean, of course, as with many technological tools, there are some really good benefits. You showed a few benefits of AI in trying to find consensus amongst people. But I want to challenge the idea that for quite a few problems that you alluded to, for instance, climate change, we know the degrowth movement, for instance, advocates for maybe 5 or 10 public policies that happen to have overwhelming popularity amongst the population, like 80 to 90%. And yet we are not implementing those public policies because there's a power struggle in there. So how far can AI take us in achieving the things that we think to know we need to do when it doesn't have any of the mechanisms that would allow the popular will to be implemented?
Yeah. No, I mean, this is a great challenge, and it's totally taken. I mean, I think that part of the paradox of AI, like many other technologies, is precisely that there is a rhetoric around democratization, which sounds plausible. So AI literally does bring the world's knowledge to like millions of people. ChatGPT has 700 million monthly users now. It's widely rolled out across, for example, the Global South. It's extensively used, for example, in India, giving access to information, ready access to information to people in a form that they just didn't have before. This is amazing and should be celebrated. And we have this story around the democratization of knowledge and the increase of productivity. AI is also shown in many studies to increase the productivity of less well-trained or capable workers more than more well-trained or capable workers. So again, kind of leveling the playing field, increasing democratization. And yet, of course, we all know that actually what is happening in the global economy right now is that AI is concentrating dramatic amounts of power in the hands of a very small number of actors whose main incentive is to increase their bottom line, or at least to win what they perceive to be an existential race among their rivals for supremacy in the AI space. And actually, incidentally, I talked about complex system effects. I think that, the challenge is that one of the corollaries of that complex system dynamic globally is that we are living in an age of monopoly. So we're living in an age in which the only way to try and control your personal piece of the world is to control everything. And we see this through monopoly capitalism, especially in the tech sector, the concept of blitzscaling, where you just win by throwing so much money into a particular sector that you dominate the whole sector, squeeze out your rivals, and only then think about making a profit. This is a standard MO for tech companies these days. We're also living through an era of monopoly in political influence as well. And this is with rising authoritarianism. Authoritarianism is a form of monopoly. And I think it is secondary to the fact that the only way you can control the political ecosystem in the 21st century in a complex system is by owning everything. And that is why it feels like the era of kind of the free market and the era, the truly free market, I mean, where true innovation drives growth, and the era of truly democratic political influence, though it feels like those are passing sadly into history. And so it is entirely true that we always have to cope with the political reality, which is that AI concentrates power as much as it devolves it, or more than it devolves it. And of course, this dramatically tempers my optimism for how this technology should be used. But I think, as you and I both know, Santiago, so what you perhaps don't know in the audience, so Santiago in his PhD worked on decision making, and in decision making there are these two frames. We can talk about the descriptive frame, which is how people do make decisions, and the normative frame, which is how people should make decisions. And I think it's perfectly possible to apply the descriptive frame and the normative frame to AI. We can be realistic about what is possible, but we can still hope for something better.
Brilliant, Chris. Thanks a lot. So I guess if there are no more questions, we can move to the roundtable. It's about time. So I will welcome Gabi to be the director of